Hello, welcome to Biology Videos at TDA. We're going to look at 13.7, which is the brain, the structure and function. This image I've got here is the sensory homunculus, which is an image to represent some part of the brain. We'll get to that later on. In this lesson, we're going to look at the gross structure, which is the overall structure, and the function of the brain. And some of the main regions we're going to go through in detail. There's quite a lot in this lesson, so I'll be giving you the PowerPoint and an activity, so you can go back over it or pause and replay the video. So I'll be going through each slide quite quickly. So the brain, first of all, why do we have it? Well, we believe we've evolved to have a brain because there's lots of advantages of having one centralised place to control a living organism. So first of all, it's going to allow quicker processing of the brain. It allows the integration of different areas, so you can coordinate, you can take information from lots of different areas and then continuously process it back and forth. So we think having many neurons in one place is going to lead to quicker processing. And it does everything around the body in terms of regulating internal environments. And a lot of the instantaneous regulation is going to start from the brain, but also you still have a hormonal control from the brain itself, and it's part of the central nervous system. There's lots of regions of the brain. We have an image here of a cut through of a dead, deceased brain. And you can see the white and the grey matter within the brain itself. And we're going to go through all these different areas throughout this lesson, and we're going to look at what each one does. You can have a go at labelling a brain to start with. I've got a very crude image you can have a go at, so you could pause the video and have a go. If not, hang on and we'll go through the different areas. Before we go any further, we're going to look at brain imaging. So for us to understand the brain, we have to image it. Now, learning about the brain we'll have done in a variety of ways. One of the ways that we do is we can brain image. So you can put someone in a situation, ask them to do something, and then you can detect what part of the brain is activated when that person is doing something, and you can learn about it. So for instance, if someone is singing and you see one part of the brain light up, you can know that that area of the brain is linked to singing. So one of the reasons we do this is we want to detect, generally it's brain damage. So this could be a contusion, this could be a tear, this could be from some kind of impact, could be some kind of genetic abnormality. But more common examples are things like strokes. So a stroke is ischemia, so it's a lack of oxygen to a part of the brain. And similar to a heart attack, it's often via a clogged artery or arteriole. So listed here are the different ways that we can scan the brain for that. So we'll go through them. So the first one, and first of all, just learn kind of the key points of these different types of brain images is my advice for this. There isn't mentioned that much in the textbook, but I'm going to give you a little bit more detail here. So a CAT scan or CT scan, which is computerized tomography, which is X-rays beamed through a person's brain, and then that produces images, and it's quite low resolution. You can do this either 2D or you can rotate it round, and that could end up with a 3D image, and you do that by a piece of software that would put an image together. You've got MRI, which is a bit more common now, higher resolution, and it allows you to see soft tissues while someone is awake as well, and we'll come to that in a second. And the way it works is it detects the magnetic field of different parts of the brain itself. So that's MRI, which is magnetic resonance imaging. You've got functional MRI, which is essentially the same thing, and there's a few different ways that they can change this. But this is a live image of it. So you can get someone to do something in specific, so get them to sing, get them to dance, wiggle their toes maybe if they're on a machine, play a guitar even, and then you can work out which parts of the brain, and then you can see if there's damage. So you can look at this image here and you can see this blue area on one hemisphere of the brain is different to the side, so this could suggest there's damage to one side in various different ways. So the idea is this imaging of the magnetic waves. PET scanning is another way of detecting parts of the brain activation. We're quite common using this to detect for cancers and tumours. So you inject some kind of chemical, which is often radioactive glucose, so these radio tracers, and they are shown up on PET scans really brightly. Okay, so if a person, let's say, has a brain tumour, you could inject them into their bloodstream with radioactive glucose. That will be absorbed by the tumour a lot, because tumours use lots of glucose, and then you can then see it. It's just another example, and it's really high resolution as well. Okay, so the brain itself. So these are the main parts of the brain. I've got the cerebrum and the cerebellum here. So the cerebrum is all of the areas in colour, and it's often referred to the cerebral cortex, which is kind of the outer layer of the brain and all these different parts of that, and then you've got the cerebellum underneath. So we're going to go through this now. So the first part of the brain, which is part of the brain stem, which is the medulla oblongata. Now this is involved in basic survival functions, breathing rate, heart rate, and regulating it. Although it wasn't that well proven, but you can cut the head off a chicken, so you might have heard the phrase run around like a headless chicken. Apparently a scientist has removed almost the entire head of a chicken and then drop fed that chicken, but they left the medulla oblongata intact because this is the part which regulates your breathing and your really basic survival functions. So apparently you can move other parts. I'll let you make your own idea, but it's a nice way to remember it. Is running around like a headless chicken means you've lost most of the brain, but you've got this medulla still, and this is going to keep you alive with the basic functions. I imagine that chicken, if it happened, didn't survive very long. And we've also got the hypothalamus, which is really important in basic survival. So I've kind of shown here that it's actually internal. It's not really seen in these outer layers. It's a bit more internal. And if you break down the word hypothalamus, it is located hypo to the thalamus, so just below the thalamus. And this is involved in lots of regulation, lots of homeostasis. So it's going to be a lot of temperature. Sorry, I haven't updated this text here. Lots of things like temperature, as well as things like water pressure, osmotic pressure, glucose, hormone concentration. There's lots and lots and lots of things that it's doing. It's regulating, and then that will work alongside the pituitary to help regulate these things. You've then got the main parts of the cerebrum itself. So the cerebrum is in charge of lots of the intelligence. Think of the sort of the primates or mammalian parts. So regulation of responding to the senses and then processing that and then responding to that. And we'll come to each individual section. So the frontal lobe is quite well developed in primates. And if we look at human evolution of earlier ancestors of humans and similar species to humans, such as Neanderthals, they have much smaller frontal lobes. If you think of gorillas, if you think of apes, if you think of chimpanzees, who are a bit close to us, chimpanzees have a slightly more developed, but other primates have a slightly smaller area. So the frontal lobe, to summarise it, is involved in intelligence decisions, complex learning, figuring out problem solving, reasoning, as well as mood. So if a person has damage to the frontal lobe, that can often change these things, so they may lose their sense of empathy or the ability to control their mood, that kind of thing. Moving on to the parietal lobe, which is involved in speech, and it allows us to determine when we get sensory information from other areas. It allows us to take that information and do something with it, such as if we have sense of touch, which is sent to this area, that will then allow us to work out, if you have your eyes closed and you're touching a rough surface, so the shape and texture of surfaces, as well as the storage of some memories. And a key point to take away from this, if you can note this down, is that all of these different areas of the brain, they work together. We don't really have these individual sections. You can damage or cut out some sections and you'll lose the ability to do things, but in terms of being able to detect, such as shouting angrily, so adding emotion to speech, that will be involved in many parts of the brain. So for instance, moving the muscles itself will be a different part, the memory will be a different part, the sense for you picking up the information to then be angry, that kind of thing. So just be aware, although we're summarising each section, they all work together. That moves on to the occipital lobe, which is strange to think about because our eyes are in the front of our head, but a lot of our visual processing goes to the back of our head. So this is why in sports like boxing, you're not allowed to hit to the back of the head because it can damage your vision. So it loses your ability to see, and therefore a person is less likely to protect themselves. And then finally, not part of the cerebrum, the cerebellum, a completely different section itself, is involved in smoothing muscle contractions. So you're likely to get questions about the linking between areas. So for instance, playing a guitar. How might a person process playing a guitar? Well, if this cerebellum smooths out, you're going to use the cerebellum, and you're likely going to be using that in conjunction with maybe memories, the ability to play different chords and that kind of thing. So you're likely to get questions that are linking different areas together, so be aware of that. You might not have to give one area. We've got the temporal lobe, so the lobe on the side around the temples, which is, again, it's quite complex. It's got some sound linked to it, but facial recognition and speech as well is involved there. Okay, so back to our friend at the beginning of the lesson, so our sensory homunculus. So this is a depiction, so it's not a real image, it's a generated image of a part of our brain called the hippocampus that's involved in touch. And this is trying to represent that different parts of our body have more or less sensory receptors and therefore more neurons in the brain. So it's saying that the neurons in the brain of our hands and our lips and our tongue, there's much more sensory receptors and parts of our brain that processes information compared to such as that of the body and the shoulders, etc. So it's just trying to show that, so it's quite a common image that you'll see. And the hippocampus is part of the limbic system. It's kind of located here. It's not on this particular diagram, which is being given by Caboodle, but it's about here. Okay, so what I've done now is I've tried to summarise each section again. So this section is for you to just pause and play. So I'm going to just a couple of sections on each part of the brain. You can pause it. You can see if you can label this now. Could you tell me what A, B, C, D and E do? So you can pause the video and have a go at that. If not, go through the video and I've summarised it again for you. Okay, and then you can have a go at a sagittal planar cut through of the brain. So you can have a go. So you're okay to label some more of the internal structures. There's some here which I haven't mentioned, so you may recognise this one before. So you can have an internet search. You can do your own research as well. So you can have a go at this. And here's the answers to the labelling. Okay, so a bit of a summary there of all of that. So the hypothalamus is going to regulate, the cerebellum coordinates, the medulla keeps us alive, and the hemispheres allow us to do all the kind of complex functions. So let's have a go at some sort of questions. So if a person had a blow to the back of the head, it might result in you seeing stars. Why might that be? So the idea is that's the occipital lobe, so that would be important to mention. That's the occipital lobe. And that's the part of the brain which is involved in vision, so it may affect our vision. Question 2. So you're whizzing down a road on a bike, you've come to a road, you have to apply the brakes, so instead of falling, what part of the brain will be doing that? And this is an example of where you're going to have different sections, so you're going to have the cerebellum, because that's going to be involved in smoothing muscle, frontal lobe, so you can have that high order decision making. You've also got the parietal lobe, which is going to help you with memories and emotion and responding and senses, and the motor cortex ability to do things. So we'll look at some diseases now of the brain. So you may or may not recognise, this is Marty McFly from a very famous film. This gentleman here, he suffers from Parkinson's disease, as is this man here, Muhammad Ali, who's passed away now, and they both suffer from this disease, which gives someone like a shaking, juddering of their muscle contractions, and we believe it's damage to a part of the parietal lobe called the substantia nigra in the basal ganglia, which is the inability to make a neurotransmitter as well. So I found some nice images to have a look at, so you can see sort of what a brain surgeon might do. So this is an example of someone who's having brain surgery, and you can see there's huge cuts into the skull here, and you can see the surgeons are looking with this magnified microscope here. And some of the things that we can do in surgery, there's lots of videos on YouTube you can do on yourself, is you can get a person to be awake during the surgery, and you can get them to do things, and then you can start cutting away parts of the brain. And if you're cutting away this little section here, and then they lose the ability to play the guitar, you'd stop and then you would then maybe remove another section. And the common things like removing tumours is that you're trying to remove the tumour tissue, but you're not trying to remove the healthy tissue because it doesn't just have a different colour or doesn't look as different as you would hoped. This is an example of one of the ways that we can correct some of these parts. And there's lots of studies evolved around them. Here's quite an interesting example of a true story about a man who had a huge pole that went through his skull. So this is the newspaper article and the journal article from it. So a man had this huge pole that went through his skull, and he was knocked over. But they don't know whether he's lost consciousness or not. But the physician was able to take this person and get him home about 10 weeks later. He would have had some changes to his life. However, unbelievable that he's had this pole go straight through his skull, and he managed to survive and live a life after it. Now, strokes themselves are brain damage, and the likelihood is if you kill a part of the brain, and the longer parts of the brain goes without oxygen due to a stroke, then that's going to cause damage to that part of the brain. And that can be what you can do with someone is you can diagnose them by asking to do various different things, and we can work out what parts of the brains have been damaged. Another example of this image of Lincoln Holmes is where he was in a car accident, but he lost the ability to recognise people's faces completely, which is a pretty scary thought. It's got another interesting, so you can see how that occurs. Now, there's a couple of more areas of the brain to have a look at. So we've got the Broca's and Wernicke's area, which is quite common to look at. And damage to these areas prevents a person from being able to speak properly, and it can slow it, which is quite a common exam area. You're not expecting to know this off by heart, but I just thought I would mention this in case it comes up. And similar to that, you have the language area, so this makes a person struggle to pick that information up. Okay, so I know there's quite a lot of information there, so the key point from this is to be able to label different parts of the brain and tell us roughly what it does, and then how do we image the brain. I've now got an activity that I'll put through on Show My Homework, which is essentially diagnosing, and I've got the answers on there itself, so have a go at those questions, and then you can mark them yourself. Thanks very much, see you next time.